people who are going to carry this conversation for us today, and I'm going to quickly introduce all three before I throw the floor open to them. So we have Aparna Sanyal. Aparna is the award-winning author of Instruments of Torture, a short story anthology. Aparna, Instruments of Torture.
It's all about plum fairies dancing in fields with. I'm kidding. It's quite a dark book.
I was going to say I'm not going to judge that one by its cover. With HarperCollins in 2024, she holds a master's from King's College, London. She's a recipient of the 14th Beulah Rose Poetry Prize and was shortlisted for the 2018 Third Coast Fiction Prize for her short story titled The Rack. Also an instrument of torture?
Yes. It's the first story in the book, actually.
All right. Instruments of Torture featured on the Telegraph's Page Turners of 2024 list, Sonali's Book Club's 12 Books to Read in 2024, and Books and Beyond podcast's Best Reads of 2024. It also featured on the Amazon India Fiction Bestseller list and has stellar reviews in Scroll, The Asian Age, The Tribune, The Telegraph, Bound, The Purple Pencil Project, among others. Her debut book, Tales Told in Rhyme, called Circus Folk and Village Freaks, released October 2018, was #1 on the Amazon India Poetry bestseller list. And it was first featured poetry recommendation on Sonali's Book Club and was very favorably reviewed in The Hindu, The Asian Age, The Indian Express, Midweek, among many others. Aparna's publication credits include the Yearbook of Indian Poetry in English 2021, the Hong Kong Proverse Poetry Prize Anthology 2020, the Pen Review, Smartish Pace, Dunes Review, Soft Blow, Vayavya.
Yeah.
Vayavya.
It's an Indian literary magazine.
Type House Literary Magazine, also among others. And Aparna's next will be a novel-length work of Gothic fiction. So welcome, Aparna, to the panel.
Thank you so much, Kirti.
Next, we have Dr. Atanu Bhattacharya, who is professor at the Department of English Studies at Central University of Gujarat, and he serves as the head of the center. His research interests are specifically in the area of science fiction as it developed in Bengal. His recent book with Preet Hiradhar on ICT in English language education, Bridging the Teaching-Learning Divide in South Asia by Springer, has been published in 2022. He is currently working on a book project on science fiction in Bengal with Liverpool University Press. He has been the recipient of Hornby Trust Fellowship, UK, Ray Grant Fellowship, UK, Regional English Language Fellowship, USA, and was awarded the Gaurav Chin by the Charutar Vidya Mandal, an educational trust in Gujarat. So welcome to the panel, Dr. Bhattacharya. And finally, we have Aisha Farooq. Aisha is an award-winning filmmaker, photographer, and researcher whose creative practice revolves around themes of dissent and belonging. A graduate of the Australian Film, Television, and Radio School with a Master of Screen and Documentary, her film, called She Who Lives, has received wide acclaim, including Best Documentary at the Australian Women's Film Festival, Best Nonfiction at the Black Snapper International Film Festival, and Critics' Choice at the Melbourne Women Film Festival. Wow. She is the founder of the A6 Films and leads as Head of Research, Innovation, and Impact at Datanox, a Sydney-based tech startup. Her current slate includes the upcoming films Lena the Night and Ishmael, which are intimate, defiant stories that interrogate systems of power while inviting empathy and reflection. My goodness. So welcome, Aisha, and welcome to all three of you on this absolutely, should I say, amazingly qualified panel. We have academics, writers, and filmmakers here. I am going to simply throw open the floor a little bit, and we can start with Aisha, then Atanu, and then Aparna. The theme of the panel, if you would like to say a few words about how you approach that theme, and then we'll just jump into it. Aisha.
Thank you, Kitty. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone here. It's just a great opportunity to be here and to share my thoughts and ideas around fantasy, which is I'm just a learner on this topic, everyone. So please bear with me. I'm learning as I'm going. I think for this topic, for me, fantasy is like an imaginative leap because I'm trained as a documentary director. So I primarily deal with real worlds and real scenarios. So for me, it's like that imaginative leap. It helps me ask that question: what if the world could look entirely different? And that question helps us challenge the rules that we thought that were they are unchangeable. So that's my just thought when I came to this session. I was like, okay, I want to learn more about this, and I want to understand what fantasy for the other writers and academics over here. So that's just my very two cents on this as a just to start it.
Amazing. Thank you, Aisha. Atanu, would you like to go next?
So again, thank you for being a part of this wonderful panel. Thank you for the introduction. I was just wondering, I mean, when we are
Atanu, the audio doesn't seem to be working.
Is this better now?
Yes, much better.
Yeah,
Thank you.
okay,
Yes.
yeah. So I just kind of pull my chair forward a bit, I guess. So I was just wondering, so when we were talking about fantasy, I mean, this is something that I come from an academic point of view from. So it's wonderful. It'll be wonderful to hear dark stories for Aparna, for example, about this idea of fantasy, etc. And Aisha's take on transmediality, because she's coming from it from a point of view of a filmmaker. So I was just wondering, when we think of fantasy, I'll just make 3 very quick points, and then we'll probably, try to elaborate on them later. So most of my work has been in the field of Bangla science fiction. So that's what I really work on, but also different kinds of speculative fiction, fantasy, horror, etc., which is a part of this larger gamut of texts that were produced over a period of 150 to 100 years. So one of the things that I keep facing as a problem is that how do you define this genre? So it's extremely difficult to define how you. So the generification of fantasy itself becomes extremely problematic. So that's probably something that we need to think about. And it's a bit tricky, especially in case of Bangla. The second thing is when we think of resistance, for example, and thinking of it as a kind of a binary of resistance versus oppression, doesn't always work in fantasy, primarily because I was thinking of stories in Bangla which apparently are under the influence of so-called resistance formats, but so they would resist something like colonial struggles, but in the story, they would use the same structures of power of oppression to oppress others while they are anti-colonial at the same moment. Okay, so it's very interesting how resistance operates in different ways. So probably that is one thing that we need to also think about. The third thing, the third point that is this idea of imagining worlds, which Aisha pointed out towards, this idea of this unreal world that is getting created through fantasy. Also, of course, operates through different points of gender, community, class, ethnicity, etc. So, and I'm thinking of most of the Bengali writers who would definitely take a position not only in terms of fantasy as a world, as a make-believe world, but also as a make-believe world through gender or make-believe world through a certain community, etc. So this world making also kind of produces different forms of truths. So maybe, again, something that maybe we'll discuss this later when we come along. So thanks so much. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Atanu. I'm making notes as we go, just so that we can come back to all of these very, very relevant points. Aparna, how about you?
So yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me as a part of this panel. In fact, I was asking Namrata that fantasy, do I really fit into it? And then as Atanu said, very, very importantly, it's such a wide genre. And in my case specifically, it would have to encompass magic realism. So how I use fantasy in my writing is to not create a parallel world, but within our structured world, to create a moment of disbelief and suspend belief for a few minutes to create a little bit of a small module of magic realism within which we can then layer the resistance through different tools. So Atanu and Aisha, and Neeti, as you were saying, instruments of torture sounds really heavy. It is in fact a comparison between medieval instruments of torture, and it's each instrument of torture is collated to a modern form of psychological, physiological, emotional kind of struggle, pressure, oppression. So there is a lot of talk of gender, race, the patriarchy, etc. So I've used each instrument to actually have in a metaphorical way to dismantle a certain power structure that I feel is problematic in our current universe. And within that, in several of the stories, as well as in my last book, which was almost, it had I think I would say it was 50% magic realism. So in that sense, that is where I bridged uh, fiction and magic realism. So that's how I would say I define fantasy. Whereas, of course, there are, there's books which are completely fantasy fiction. That's not the genre that I write, or speculative fiction, which Othanu works with, but those are areas that I don't find myself particularly good with. However, what I do like to do is kind of infuse everyday life with a certain sudden magical leap, as Aisha was saying, and then within that leap, try to find meaning. So that's
Oh.
how I would approach fantasy.
Thank you. I have so many notes. I'd as an academic, Othanu will appreciate this. I'm constantly taking notes. so, so I already have a bunch of stuff that I would love for us to go into. I think first, just to think about genre, as Othanu so rightly points out, and magic realism, as you say, Parna, and so, let's, for the sake of this discussion, have a broad definition. I haven't introduced myself, but my area of research, doctoral, and following that has been on different narratives of violence and how they're gendered and raced and so on in armed warfare mostly. And I do this through literature, and so I'm looking at narratives of violence. And how they how they construct collective identity formation. But in my fiction, and I've co-edited the Me Too handbook on the Routledge handbook on the Me Too movement, and so. A lot of these things converge for me, the violence and the gender and so on. And in my fiction writing, my novels are fantasy, my short stories are science fiction or spec fic, and my poetry is basically sentimental. So there's ways in which all of us, whether we're academics, filmmakers, multimedia poets, etc., we work at the intersections of genre. And ideas in many ways. So as not to confine ourselves to any one thing. Let's have the liberty to discuss all genres as we would like to. I want to start with this idea that Aisha, you mentioned right in the beginning. What would the world look like if we could imagine it differently? And I wanted to start by saying, isn't this the work of resistance? I mean, when a feminist says, what would the world look like if women could vote? Or a post-colonial scholar would say, well, what would have the world look like without, Isn't this the work of resistance? I know it's the work of fiction, but isn't this what resistance does, to imagine a different world and say, what if?
So absolutely, I think the rightly mentioned and rightly expanded on what I earlier said, is that this idea of resistance, I have always struggled because I grew up reading all the fiction stuff and popular fiction, that too, spy thrillers of Imran Series and love stories of Farhat Ishtiyaq and spiritual narratives of Umaira Ahmad. And that was really popular fiction and dramatized and everything. Yet, however, they understood my understanding, my craft of storytelling. But however, they have something that element of fairy tales. They have that, the male protagonist is gonna come and save the quote unquote women. Or there's a special narrative that goes with popular fiction. And when I was trained as a documentarian, I was really, my initial films were different. They were really fantasy. If I would like to mention here, I don't know if that goes with the question or not, but my first film was Cooked. We imagine a fantasy world where the father of gastronomy met at a dinner with a Sydney morning model world writer, food writer. And that world, that dinner that we created was completely our fiction. We created that entire world, and that allowed us to speak and reflect on what food has now become. It has now become a performative art, and not just a joy and connection. So it has allowed the audience to feel and reflect on what's going on in the world right now. It kind of softened the critique and comment, yet we were able to do it. It was difficult in a normal scenario, but the fantasy allowed us, because there are two characters completely from different centuries. They came together, sat at a dinner, and talked about what is now a popular genre, as in the modern world of cooking and modern shows. So that is one thing that I learned in that process. I learned was that resistance is not just about directly saying something. It's very subtle. It's subtle when you choose the character that you want to choose, the characters, the protagonist, the antagonist. When you choose that narrative, that characters, they lead the resistance. And so for me, when I came now, have come to the realization that my characters are really, I really want to focus on women characters, because I want to, again, it's just a, I'm not a feminist, to be honest, but I would maybe someday I will be having the courage to say that I'm a feminist, and maybe I'm still young enough to say that I'm not. But I would say it's it's a balance that we have to create with the subtle, with the art of storytelling, yet with the resistance. And fantasy helps us do that. Even as a documentary director, I still use that imaginative leap. In my other film, She Who Lives There, who got all the critical acclaim, we used the real trains as the story world. Yet the idea and the intention was that all the participants are going to hop on the train, and we're going to talk about their real life experiences in a scenario which is a dreamlike story world. They are in a transition phase. They are not in their homes. They are not in their offices. They are in a transition phase. They are in that imaginary world where they usually don't exist, or they don't really think about. And I hop onto the train and I speak to them about their personal experiences, and they share it with me. I'm truly honored to be that. But yeah, so I think resistance, again, for me, is just about that very subtle element that we choose through our characters, and not necessarily about something which I would like to say that I am the flag bearer of something, but it's very subtle for me, if that
Aisha,
answers your question.
you definitely sound like both a flag bearer and, may I say, a feminist. So I would say just go out there and own it. Say, yes, I am a feminist. It doesn't take a lot, actually. And you more than sound like a feminist to
I
me.
like to hear it from others saying that, okay, you are that. So I'm like, okay, I'll take it. Thank you for
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. But what an interesting train of thought, if I may call it that. I to choose characters, I remember as a writer, the first time that I was writing a story, and often, as you know, we don't know where the story will go. And when I started describing my character, I'm like, what? I mean, and it took an effort of will for me to make my protagonist a middle-aged, overweight, cranky woman. Instead of this wonderful, nubile 17-year-old hormone-fueled, perfectly bodied kind of person who's going to save the world. I mean, which 17-year-old are we going to trust in the world? We know that it's middle-aged women who are out there saving the world. Sorry, I'm middle-aged. I say it with some humor. So yeah, just that it takes exactly what you're saying, that the choices you make are your act of resistance. To make a female protagonist to begin with, to have a disabled protagonist, to have, yeah, absolutely, not to take over myself. But Atanu, something about, the intersection of different kinds of resistances, different kinds of oppressions. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that, given what Aisha is saying?
Aisha kind of made me think about a few things here and there. So one of the things that I was wondering about is when we think about fantasy, for example, And if you accept the premise that fantasy always provides resistance, that may not be again true at all times. I was just thinking in terms of, so what Aisha is probably pointing out through documentary filmmaking is also this idea of fantasy, what I would call fantasy as mode and fantasy as form. So if it is fantasy as mode, then probably it has kind of resistance built within it. But if it is fantasy as form, then it can also be used for revisionism. So where you visit, you create an unreal world, but actually bring back all the stereotypes and all the breakdown. So just as an example, for example, you go back to early texts and then reclaim science through those early texts. So, or you go back to early history and reclaim a certain kind of an ethnic history, which kind of suppresses all forms of resistances. So there, I think fantasy is being used as a form rather than a mode at all. So the mode has been
So if
completely
I may
distinct.
interrupt you, I know that a lot of our viewers may not be very clear on the distinction. So not to put you on the spot, but very quickly, just what is the difference
Sure.
between?
So fantasy as a mode, I was thinking more in terms of as an employment. For example, when you said that the choices that we make in making characters, for example, so the very idea of the use of a certain style of writing, which is not, let's say, a form of writing that is going to make me sell books, or something that is extremely market oriented, but something that makes me think. So a kind of a resistance is inbuilt within the modality that I choose. So it might be the modality of characters, for example, the modality of plots that I do. So the very example that you gave of choosing a certain kind of a woman rather than a certain other kind of woman. So these are modes of or choices that we make. So probably a simpler word to use would be fantasy as choice. And when I say the form, so the form is available to us historically over a period of time, but the form can be used for different sorts of political purposes. That's what I'm trying to say. And so that might not always indicate resistance. So I've been involved in theater and I've written plays about it. For me, the form of theater always was a form of resistance in a certain sense. But I never thought that the form of theater could be used to produce, for example, speculative or fantasy film, because the theater did not seem to produce that form at all. Till I read Manjula Padmanabhan's Harvest, and I realized, oh God, yes, this can be done. So even that, so what she does wonderfully, of course, is that she uses the form to completely change the form itself, to produce a different kind of a mode altogether. So maybe we can think of fantasy of that type. So my only worry is that fantasy is not always resistance. It could be possibly used for different political purposes in a certain sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely, and very true. I think that so much of, fantasy, speculative fiction, a lot of it reinforces, as you were saying, even if there are many that don't actually question or disrupt, the status quo. But even those that do disrupt one will reinforce it somewhere else. And so you may disrupt the colonial and just reinforce the gender. Here is your, as I said, 17-year-old. My God, no offense to 17-year-olds. They're fabulous. My fantasy is young adult. And I always say that I have the greatest admiration for young adults because, my God, the world that they're living in. But yeah, absolutely, that while it's questioning one, it's busy reinforcing another. Absolutely. I'd so much to come back to, Atanu, and I know that we had a list of questions, but we'll come to them if we need them, which I really don't know if we will at this point. Aparna, this bringing together of history and the contemporary through magic realism or using magic realism in different ways. How did you fix on a certain, so is it if you use medieval instruments of torture and they come to us through medieval England, for instance, or Europe, and then would you be able to connect them with another geography? So what I'm saying is that when you shift histories, can you also shift geographies? And how does that work when you're thinking about, resistance?
Absolutely. So the thing is, for me, the title the instruments of torture came through me, as you said, via a European exhibition that I saw of actual medieval torture instruments. And that's when I realized that the way human beings torture each other is universal. So it may take on the format of, say, the Phalarides bull, which was used in ancient Greece or Rome, I forget which. However, when you look at what it technically, what did a Phalarides bull do? It trapped a person inside a bronze bull structure, and the person would be trapped inside, and then the bull, they would start putting fire underneath it and heating it up. And what would happen was there was a certain structure made into it, a certain sound structure. So then when the person was yelling inside in pain, it would come out as sort of like a sibilant hiss on the outside. So there's these very, very incredibly detailed ways in which the human mind thinks of torturing another human being. And I looked at it and I thought that this is so universal, in the sense that when you look at this, the psychological way in which we torture each other, there are no bounds in the way we do it. So what I actually equated it to was a boy who has a degenerative disease. So he's trapped within his own body and is burning, but he cannot explain it to anybody because he's nonverbal. And that's how I tried to bring disability into it. And he's nonverbal, and he has a very strange laugh. And that laugh actually manifests at times that he's the most distressed or has done something that is not particularly laugh worthy. So I know it sounds kind of like a stretch to collate it, or to compare it, but I'd like to think that it comes together in the sense that it's just the metaphorical way in which you would juxtapose these two very, very very strong visuals with each other. And why I used the Indian context was certainly only because it was a lived context, and I did not want to appropriate any other culture that I'm not very familiar with. And why I used the trope of instruments of torture was just because it really massively appealed to me. And and what I've done is, at the beginning of each story, I've written the actual the ways in which they were used, and the actual description of the instrument of torture. So then the reader is encouraged to take away from the story what they would like to take away from the story, because we do not within the story draw any real parallel. What I just do is I just tell the story, which is based mostly in urban and rural India in current times, or you could maybe take it back to the 90s or the 2000s. So so that's how I've tried to kind of bridge the gap between the two. And specifically in the previous book that I wrote, Circus Folk and Village Freaks, was actually I'd like to think that it was like a very twisted version of Malgudi, because I'm greatly inspired by the work of R.K. Narayan, and I grew up reading it. But in my own subverted self, in my own subverted worldview, what I did was, for example, in the first story, I dealt with caste structures through the idea of a man who turned into a crocodile. So he woke up one day and he had turned into a crocodile. And what ensued was the village priests came and saw, and they said, this is a miracle. And they wanted to deify him. And how then a temple structure was built around this poor man's house, and how there was a fight between, and his wife became sort of the, the custodian of this great deity. And how at the end of the day, the man just sat, and at the same time, the audience is invited to wonder, did he really turn into a crocodile, or was it mental illness? Because, and in that, there's actually, there's an amazing artist who actually did sketches for me. So the sketch actually shows a crocodile with a tika. But was he really a crocodile? Was he acting like a crocodile? Was it mental illness, which was then used by the priests and the village structure and the caste hierarchy to kind of subvert the meaning of the entire thing into something? And at the end of it, what we've shown is that Subramaniam lay in his swamp all alone, at the end of the day. So that's how I've kind of tried to build resistance to the idea of magical realism, as I call it, or fantasy. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but
Wow, it makes me really want to read this stuff that you've written and to watch Aisha's documentaries. And my goodness, such a world of books and films and so that we haven't seen that is out there. Wow. Um, I was just thinking when you were saying that he thinks or has turned into a crocodile, it reminds me a lot of Kafka's
Kafka. Yes,
Metamorphosis. And of
absolutely.
course, yeah,
Yeah.
and of course the guide in which he becomes deified by the village around him,
Exactly. Yeah.
and it's so fascinating, and it kind of brings me to one of the things I wanted us to think about a little bit, which is what are the voices in our heads when we create? So, in terms of literary and other artistic, influences in terms of the academic that never shuts up in our heads, or is it the critic? All of you have all of these many fellowships and awards between you. It's amazing. Do you think that what will the critic say? What will this newspaper or that award say? What did Kafka do? Who are these people in our heads and how do they influence what we do? Can I start with you, Atanu, since you're our academic on the panel?
All right. Yeah. Okay. I don't know. It's very difficult. So,
Atanu, maybe you want to move a little closer. We can't hear you.
sorry. So, is this better?
Not really.
Let me try this. Is this better now?
A little bit.
A little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll try to kind of shout a
Much
bit.
better. Excellent.
better now.
Yes.
So I'll try to shout a bit. I think it's playing truant now, this laptop. Anyway, so I don't know. I got into science fiction out of, I have no idea how I got into it actually. I had speculative fiction. So I remember I was interested in kind of science and technology studies, and I was doing all that. And of course, as a Bengali growing up in and around Bengal in Calcutta mostly, you would I mean, depending on, of course, the class and the community that you came from, your houses would have Satyajit Ray and all the fantasy books, and you'll be surrounded by them. You would grow up reading those books. And then I suddenly came across the possibility of some writers. One, of course, was Supriya Goswami, who worked on children's literature. So I said, okay, let me go back to these readings and see what I can do with them. And then I stuck upon this rich vein of science fiction that started right from 1835. And then I realized these guys were writing science fiction much before even H.G. Wells and Jules Verne was doing it. So let me get back to this history and see what they were trying to do. So one of the ways that I got into it is actually by rereading these texts that I had read in my childhood in a certain sense. The second thing, of course, was when I started doing it in 2012, there was hardly any criticism around science fiction because the Indian academia still had a very strong sense of literary fiction and genre and popular fiction. Popular fiction is something that you do for the market. Literary fiction is something that you do for the academia. The academics are not supposed to dabble into popular fiction. So all these strange kind of academic notions operated. Which
I'm
also
so glad
probably
you're calling them strange, Atanu, now with the vantage point of 12 years since, 13 years since. It's okay now to say that was so strange.
Yeah.
But it's true, it was a battle that we all fought. Yes,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you. Go on.
And then, so I started writing about it, found kindred souls around. So one, I'm sure that, Bodhisattva in Oslo was doing this, in America was doing it. So some interesting friends got around and we started thinking about, science fiction as a genre, etc. The third thing was, of course, when I started reading Bengali science fiction, one thing that it spurred me into, for example, was reading science fiction in general. So I started reading these all classics, American and European and everything. So, and many of these authors, what fascinated me mostly, for example, was Le Guin's novels, for example, or Octavia Butler, for example, and the kind of things that she was doing with this idea of science fiction. In fact, in one of her interviews, she says that what you consider to be future is not future for me at all. It has already happened to me in the past. So race is not, it is apocalyptic for you. Race is past for me, etc. So very interesting ways of looking at it. So maybe that. And the third, the final thing that I wanted to say, which kind of forced me to get into this field is the sudden interest in academia, in especially after the coming of a certain discipline like cultural studies, in popular culture and what was happening in popular culture. And one obvious fallout of that, I guess, is that you have so many books on fantasy, on speculative fiction. For example, Tarun has brought out these two extremely important volumes on Indian science fiction. There is 2 volumes on detective science fiction now. He's, I think, planning to bring out another volume on crime fiction now. So there's sudden interest in all these so-called marginal genres which were kept, I remember Leela Majumdar, one of the writers in Bengal. So in one of her stories, she says that one of the protagonists, is pretending to read in Tagore, and inside Tagore, he has got all these extremely racy crime thrillers that he keeps on reading. So as an academic, I am thankful that the racy crime thrillers are out now. We can still read Tagore and we can also do academics on racy crime thrillers. So that's how I got into it. Yeah.
Wow.
Thanks.
Wow. As usual, I have notes and we'll come back to so much of what you're saying. But Aisha, how about you? Who are the people in your head?
Oh yeah, being a documentarian and filmmaker, I think the voices that I um, find myself often tangling with is um, why this story? Why who gets to tell this story? Why we are telling this story in this world right now? Because I feel this responsibility towards truth and ethics, all these things. But so for example, now the stories that I'm currently working with, they really have to push past my boundaries of my rational brain, because I was really struggling with these questions, these voices in my head. Why am I going to tell this story? Why now? So I really had to answer these questions before I said yes to them. But I was really not able to answer all of the questions that was in my head. So that's where I allowed my imaginary brain to, take the lead and give me some ideas around the silences between the facts and the truth. So I kind of, so these are the voices that are, but I have learned, as I'm saying, that I have grew up reading fiction and all those stories, but I have uh, adopted from those stories is the happy ending, the fairy tale note, which is often not the case with documentaries. So that's really I struggle with this notion that really have to. So one of the stories that I am currently working on, the main protagonist is not alive anymore in this, and I'm struggling in this. My entire team thinks that I'm not going to put this on the screen, that he kind of died in the end. So my entire team is sure that she is not going, and I'm like, no, this time around I'm actually going to put it there. So there's still voices in your head what I'm just kind of all the time battling with, what's the truth and what's the fiction, and how I want at the end of the day, the question that I want to address is what do I want the audience to feel at the end of the story? That's what I really want to answer. What do I want them to carry with them when they leave this world that I have built? So that for me is a hope and inspiration in the most of the stories, in the most of the cases. That's where I want the audience to live. So be it fiction or be it documentary. Now that I'm transitioning into fiction and writing more about fiction world and moving away from documentaries, but it's really and I kind of um, listen carefully from the truth, absorb it, take it, and then shape it with the metaphors and symbolism and visual flair to craft in a story that hopefully will leave the audience in some sort of hope and inspiration. So my voices, they never go away. They are always there. But I wonder, I cannot answer all the questions. Maybe when I'm looking back, when I go through in the entire process of making the film and distributing, and something happens with them and people will see, hopefully will see and watch the films, after then I'll be able to answer all of these questions. So I kind of don't really worry about the all the questions, but yes, the questions that are really important for me are why me? Why am I telling this story in this world right now? And what do I want the audience to feel?
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I think you're charting sort of the relationship and the trajectory from truth through fiction to message. And
Yeah.
again, so much to come back to, and I will come back to it. But Aparna, to throw this question to you, and especially to think about, they say that if you resist, you must hope. Uh, that so that even if it has an unhappy ending, the message is hope. In that sense, when you write these stories about different kinds of discrimination or torture or suffering, what is the message that you're putting there? Just as a way to think about it, please. Otherwise, just think about the other question instead.
No. I think what I'm actually trying to talk about is hope and acceptance, accepting differences, and in a sense, trying to trying really hard to say that neurodiversity is actually neuronormality, and we need to be less discriminatory, and in every way possible examine our relationships, examine our worldview, examine, so obviously every writer comes to their work with their own worldview, and then they're trying to project that onto the reader. And obviously, I mean, that is something I do as well. And as a writer and as a person, I do believe in, being a loud and proud feminist, and being a person who believes in subverting the norm, and looking at power structures, and saying why are they this way, while being very aware that I'm sitting in a place of privilege and coming from a place where I can barely imagine what, say, a child in Gaza or in Pahalgam is going through right now. So being very, very mindful of not co-opting or coming from a very white liberalized point of view, or a Indian intelligentsia point of view, trying to grout my stories as much in approachability um, as layered, trying to make them layered as well, not just telling a story of, telling it in a more oblique way, rather than just arriving at your um, whatever answers you want to take from it, or whatever viewpoints you want to draw from it, to try and reach it like, say, poetry, which has to be more abstruse in its telling for it to have any heft or meaning. It must have those layers, and it must have that, that sort of nazakat, or that. So in terms of who I look to when I look at the greats of writing, so I don't really write speculative fiction, I don't really write fantasy fiction as such. What I do write, and what I think I write, is literary fiction. And what I've chosen to write for my next novel is, of all things, Gothic fiction. And when Aisha was saying she likes to think about what the person, her reader, or the person who's watching, will take away from it, I'm quite the opposite. Because if I was taking that away, then I would not be writing Gothic fiction. Market is not really Indian. Gothic fiction writers quite simply do not exist. As Atanu was saying, there is such a rich vein of writers coming out of Bengal, who came out of Bengal, who actually helmed so much Gothic fiction at that point of time. And they were incredible when it came to writing thrillers, when it came to writing spec fic and everything. However, now, especially within women writers within India, Gothic fiction is it's difficult to find a market for it. And I'm struggling to find more Indian authors. So in fact, I called for a book. I've just ordered a book called I'm forgetting the name, but it seemed very interesting because it had a stream of Gothic fiction within it. And by Gothic fiction, I need to make the demarcation between horror, outright horror, and Gothic fiction. It's very different. Essentially, it's the difference between mode, as you were saying, Athanu, and mode, and actually horror for horror versus horror as a vehicle to address a systemic issue that you're trying to look at. So the people that I look at, the writers that I look at, are mostly international writers, like a Catriona Ward or a Laura Purcell, or and Alma Katsu. These are all women writers. I gravitate heavily towards women writers who are writing specifically Gothic fiction. But of course, I could take, I'm very heavily influenced with Indian writers, like, for example, Satyajit Ray or R.K. Narayan. I find them fantastic. Ruskin Bond will tell a simple story with such finesse. So, so many influences. And of course, then I always go to my favorite genre, which is like my guilty secret, is paleo fiction. I love to read about prehistoric creatures and what could have been if they inhabit our world. So it's not really science fiction. It comes under science fantasy. So it's actually called paleofiction. And I love the idea that underneath us, there may exist megalodons and things like that. So I will do, whether I'm reading Kafka or I'm reading about megalodons, it all comes together in my work. There will always, and I write a lot about trauma and repressed trauma and generational trauma. So I find that using fantasy to tell that makes it more palatable for the person reading. And it makes it more palatable and easier for me to address it. Because I'd like to think of my writing as being a vehicle of what my internal person is, my internal fire is. So yeah, so I think fantasy really helps me tell the story of trauma in a easy, palatable way.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear you say that, Aparna. It's actually what my doctoral thesis was about,
Oh,
to
wow.
say why a particular mode of telling of violence, and why. So I just call it non-real in order to be able to encompass all the many, many different ways. Why is it necessary, actually, not just fun or evocative or whatever it is, useful, but actually the genre through which events of great violence can be told effectively. So I'm really excited to hear you say this. I have so many things I want to circle back to. So one of them, Bodhi is an old colleague and friend. So thank you for bringing him up, and he's actually done stellar work in this area, as of course has Tarun, as you say. I was thinking, just to pull out a strand of what we've been talking about. We've mentioned sort of appropriation a couple of times, or, who is speaking, where we're comfortable speaking from, what we know, how we're sort of treading into other territories. And I was wondering if this is a constant fear, or if it is something that turns up from time to time. And so I know, going back to my early novels, I know that there is a very strong sort of, as you say, Aparna, very privileged upper class bias in the thing. And I think that, there's this comfort in being able to speak about what you know and what you have lived through, and so on. And I suppose if I had had what they now call sensitivity readers, and so on, someone would have pointed this out to me. As it was, I waited to figure it out myself, and I've tried to address this later. But there's also, as you know, there's many of these literary controversies circling about cultural appropriation. But I was thinking that, it doesn't have to be another country and another culture. It can be, we're all so, at least I am, so niche driven in my own existence that for me to write about somebody else in India itself, forget South Asia or otherwise, would require so much work and so much research. And in my own work, I've tried to bridge it in different ways. I don't think that we should be silo driven, only write, there's a way in which international, what shall I call it, publication politics pushes especially non-white writers into these little ghettos. Oh, you're Indian, why don't you write about India? As a kind of privilege to you, that you should be the native informant kind of thing. Or, you know what I mean. And so I think, while of course we should write about that there are some cultures that get to travel and some that don't, So it's okay for us to talk about elves and dragons, but it's not okay for us to talk about something that's less known to the international world. It becomes exoticized, and so on. And so I was wondering if this is part of your practice. How do you negotiate this? We know as fantasy, speculative poets, science fiction, whatever it is that we're doing, we know that we have to step out of our comfort zone. We should not be confined. So how do you negotiate this? Anyone who would like to go first? I don't have. Atanu?
All right. Actually, a quick response to Aparna. I think she said some fantastic things. So I was just wondering, as a kind of a joke, complete joke, so when you said that you're moving towards Gothic and the Gothic fiction, etc., I was immediately reminded of actually Gothic romances might sell. So if you write
Yeah,
Gothic,
I wish I could, Atanu. All my romances turn bloody and twisted and way too dark for the romance. I wish I could, right? Just find a
yeah,
6'4" white male model to
yeah,
put on the
yeah.
cover, and it would sell out on Amazon immediately, right?
Shirtless with flowing hair.
Yeah. No, I was just
Exactly. How
wondering
I
about this
wish.
entire massive success of Twilight series, if you remember.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
No,
this Gothic vampirish romance might sell. And that also reminded me of this entire notion of the sentimental novel that developed in the 18th and the 19th century, which was very, very women. It was mostly written by women. The men called it sentimental novel. And about 100 years later, Ruqayya Shekhawat Hussain, an early feminist in Bengal, an educationist, who also writes this wonderful short story called Sultana's Dream, which is a kind of a fantasy. And she, in that story, says, when women take over science, so the story is about this fantasy world called Ladyland, where women have taken over everything, governance, science, and men have been sent to the she doesn't call it Zanana, she calls it Mardana. So like women have been sent to Zanana, so men in this world have been sent to Mardana now. So men are confined to household chores and taking care of the babies, etc. So in this world, when there's a discussion going on, this woman says in the middle of it that when the women first took over, the men said it is a sentimental nightmare. Okay. And she actually brings back this entire trope that was used for women writers, that they can write only sentimentally, etc. Yeah. So, and coming back to the question of that Geeti was posing, which kind of is related to what I was saying earlier, and thanks, Aparna, for setting me on this trend of thought. I was just wondering whether the genre of fantasy itself is extremely flexible right from the beginning. So it could kind of incorporate everything, first of all. Secondly, this idea of messianic power in fantasy, this taking down of totalitarian worlds, etc. Contains within it a certain form of resistance, but also this idea is often mediated through different sorts of, different sorts of styles, shall we say. For example, I'm thinking of Bengali fantasy forms. And there is this novel that is written in 1892, very early novel, which is by this person called Trailokanath Mukhopadhyay. So Trailokanath Mukhopadhyay. And this guy writes this novel called Kankavati. And Kankavati is actually a well-known folk tale in Bengal. She draws the story from a folk tale, and it divides the novel into two parts. The first part is a social realist novel where the woman is forced to get, she's forced to get married. She goes into a coma. She doesn't want to get married to the man. So it's absolutely about rural Bengal and the social realist. The second part of the novel is a complete adaptation of Alice in Wonderland and moves into a fantasy world through the dream of the woman. Okay, so even narratorial choices and narrative forms undergo changes within the fantasy world. Now, I have always wondered, I've written about this novel, and I don't know what to call it. Should I call it fantasy? Should I call it a mix, a hybrid form of social realist novel and a fantasy, etc.? So maybe when we are asking this question of where we stand in terms of fantasy and, in terms of the import of fantasy and the effect of fantasy and the impact of fantasy, Maybe also we need to look at the forms that fantasy sometimes employs, and Aparna gives the example of Aparna. I would rather call it fantasy because I mean, fantasy kind of can include everything, I guess. I don't know. I mean, probably it could. If Travilokonath could do it with a social realist form and a folk form and a fantasy form all combined together and an adaptation form, he adapts Alice in Wonderland, which was just translated into Bengali at that point of time. So this is something that I thought might be relevant. I don't know whether I've been able to answer the question, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, never mind the question. I think the points you make are so interesting. And as an academic, I always think that we impose form and genre on top of what we have as a way of trying to understand it. And 1892 is probably before these forms were, crystallized and put out as theory for the rest of us academics to use as templates and so on. And it's to me, I feel like it's a good way to use it as a guiding kind of thing to say, oh, this is an element of fantasy. This is what I might, and then use it to say what you need to say. I hate to be so flippant about theory, but I survived the 80s and 90s and early 2000s as an academic when theory was a big thing. And I don't know, I have a healthy respect for it, but also a healthy disrespect for it. But I think it's really interesting that you should bring out all of these things. This idea of the sentimental novel, which also part of it, it's I don't know if that's the one you're referring to, but in Victorian British fiction, there's this whole strain of what you call the sentimental novel, and the idea that men are not sentimental when they write. Where the sentimental journey is one of the first novels written, and the idea that sentiment is something that belongs to women, and then fairy tale and all of that gets cast into this thing that young women, ladies of leisure, read. Men are busy writing about different things. It's such an artificial
Yeah.
sort of patriarchal construct. But I was thinking of, I don't know who reads Terry Pratchett here, but
I
Monstrous
do.
Regiment. Thank you. Monstrous Regiment, which he takes from that initial John Knox's
Yeah.
treatise, where he calls the Queen Elizabeth on the throne, to saying this is a monstrous regiment, the idea that a woman should be on the throne, and then how different authors have taken it and run with it. And as it happens, to my mind, of all the many people who've used that text and written books called Monstrous Regiment, many of them by women, Pratchett's is actually the most feminist. And not to take over the conversation again, I thought let's hear what Aisha has to say about this particular kind of, I don't know, this, who is speaking and to whom, since you said you brought this up to begin with, Aisha.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that who gets to tell which story and to whom and who is the audience. And like I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and I'm trained here. I lived in brought up in Pakistan and then lived here in Australia. So what they expect, what I am being expected from in this environment in Australia is to tell migrant stories. Because even though I'm a privileged migrant, I was not a forced migrant who had to flee the war or something. But even then, I'm being put in a position that I need to be telling these stories, and especially come up with female characters only, and those who are migrant and flee the war or something. So there is a perception that you people expect of you, which kind of makes me think it's been a struggle in the last 6 months or so that I've been thinking about it, if these are my stories anymore. Because my earlier first film, She Who Lives, it was really based on migrant mothers. That was really the starting point, and it worked well here. And we're glad I made that film. That do I want to make these stories over and over again? I am that sort of a person who wants to tackle a subject and then get over it and do something new and something different and try something different. So I don't know if it fits into fantasy or not, but I would like to like the way I'm the two new films that I'm working on. They are documentaries, but they are hybrid. They are completely different in terms of form and genre and in the form and mode to what I have done previously. They are really what should I say? Hybrid is the only word that I could say. It's a mix of both observational and imaginative. The one film is about Russian women who is coming from Soviet era and that sort of, and I really had to imagine and I have to study and research about that. I have to imagine that world she has come from. even though she is a migrant musician, and that's even though there are some similarities over there, but and then I have to imagine her history, and I have to imagine what she has been through. So that sort of imagination still exists in my work, and even in the other story, again, the to imagine what the world would look like if he would have survived more, and how his legacy is going on. I have to imagine that. But yeah, this is just by my experience. From my experience that I have seen, is we should not. I think I'll be fair if I'm fair to say that we should not confine artists into boxes as to we should be telling this much of story, and we should imagine. When we go to imagination, it's just so wild and crazy. Even though I'm not much into speculative fiction and horror. These are not so much my genres. I'm more of a, if I might talk about my guilty pleasure, it's all about love stories, and that it's just completely a no-go area when it comes to what I make. So that's completely different from what I read. So that influence anyhow, both. So yeah, that's just my experience sharing that we should not confine artists and writers or filmmakers in and even though I do struggle with this question, who is telling the story, I think ethics is very important to me as well. Who is telling the story, and we need to be putting ourselves in the shoes of who the protagonist or the to be in that position to actually feel what they have gone through, the emotional journey. We have to imagine their stories in our hearts and minds.
Yeah. Aparna, I was just thinking about a lot of the stuff that you said, but when we were thinking about history and geography, and I mentioned Kafka and uh, clearly so much of what you're bringing out in your stories are human truths. They can be anchored in any one context, but they clearly are relevant to so many people um, outside of it. Do you have an audience in your mind when you write? Who is your, because you also made this, talk about the literary as against the popular or whatever.
Popular.
And however we may want to break down or not break down those boundaries, do you have, who are you writing to? Who is in your head when you write?
So, Geeti, let me honestly, I'm very bad at these things. I write what feels like the truth to me and what rings true. I will only write it otherwise, I will definitely see it as co opting somebody's experience. Only if the words ring true to me and only if I have some sort of lived experience in it. So I like to say that even in Instruments of Torture, each and every character in that story I have personally known, I have interacted with, I have only written their trajectories in a fictional way. What if their lives were to go in this direction? So even when I write about a child who has multiple sclerosis or who has deformity, it is somebody I have known, interacted with, the family, everything. So that's very important to me. Secondly, if I had an iota of sense, I would be writing, keeping a reader in mind, but I don't, which is why, again, unfortunately, in today's, I don't know whether you'd call it unfortunately, but it's the way the trend is going, is that people do gravitate more towards memoirs and true stories and true crime. And that also comes down to a lot of the way social media is playing into our lives and how we like to have bite-sized, very, very easy to digest content. So when you're writing a memoir, you say, I did this and I did that. And at the end of the day, the person is saying, hey, I'm going to get a ready-made lesson from this, so it's easy for me to read. So it's like 5 ways in which I can achieve freedom, I can achieve greatness, like this influencer on Instagram, right? So those are the books that are easily marketable today. So when I do look at writing, I do realize that I need much more to focus on those points, and I don't, which is one of the reasons that I talk about it very openly. I'm actually going to workshop my next book at a writer's retreat in June, because I realize I may not be writing for the correct market, for the simple reason that in India, people are gravitating more towards simply written books which are going to tell you here's how I've lived my life, here's how I can help you live yours. So whether they're memoirs, whether true stories, whether they're inspirational, whether they're how-tos, these are the books that are selling. Or then it could be something like rom-com, which is, again, as you said, this sentimental novel in a modern format, which is easy. It's easy to digest in small, in small quotable quotes, as it were, and easy to have your life with. So you could do like an Instagram scroll and have those quotes from that kind of a book. Whereas if you talk about something as abstruse as poetry, people would not want to consume it. So when it came to my first book, I was told flat out, do not bother to approach the top 5 publishers. You're not going to get a publishing deal. So I chose to go with a boutique publisher, after which I did a lot of research on how to approach the market. And luckily for me, the book hit the Amazon bestseller list and was #1 on Amazon poetry bestsellers for several weeks. And I myself was amazed. And no, I honestly, I just think because it was an easy to read book. If it was my more abstruse work, I know that it would have lain at the bottom of Barisan somewhere and never seen the light of day. So whether you have the awareness of knowing or recognizing who you're writing the story for, I feel is a privilege if you have that kind of understanding. And if you're able to have that focus when you're trying to write your story, I think that comes to very few. And if it does, it's a great gift. It doesn't come to me because I will tell the story that is urgently beating in my chest and urgently needs to be told, to the point that I cannot sleep, I cannot function until it's told. And it's been marinating in my head for literally years. So I do think that contemporary writers need to have this awareness. They need to have their marketing in place. They need to have an entire, it's very necessary. I know it creates pigeonholes and is the worst thing to do, but it's very necessary when you write a simple thing like a query letter to a publisher, a query letter to an agent today. This is the genre I'm writing in. That's the first thing they're going to ask you. When you when you submit to any literary house, they're going to say, what's your audience? Where do you see this market sitting? Give us 2 or 3 authors that you can see yourself pitted against. Now, I find these extremely pigeonholing concepts, and I chafe against them. But that's the way the market is going. That is the reality of the market today. And I think that, if anybody is watching this and is looking at writing as a profession, first of all, make sure your bread and butter is taken care of, because writing in India is not going to do that. So I always think that look at other media. If you're a writer, look at other media in which you publish. If you're in it for the academia, as you said, literary fiction versus popular fiction, be very, very aware that you are going to be pigeonholed. You're going to be expected to tell your story to a certain audience in a certain genre. And it can be extremely frustrating to do that.
Yeah, yes to all of that. I hear everything you're saying, and I recently signed this contract for a poetry collection, and this is exactly what
Congratulations on that. Sorry,
thank you. I'm very pleased. But this is exactly what I heard, which is that we want to publish something that is literary. We know we will make no money on it, but we think we should. As a good publisher, we should have. However, what is your guiding theme? Who are you writing for? How can we market it? Who are the other 2, 3, exactly as you said, who are the other 2, 3 writers that we can, sort of sell you as part of, say, this is a nature writer, this is a Mary Oliver, this is a whatever it is. And to all of these, because you have, as you say so rightly, you have to be all of these things for yourself. You have to be your own literary agent, and you have to be your own marketing person. You have to be in your own. And for most of us, it's hard enough just to be your own writer.
Exactly.
Instead of doing all of that, I actually wanted to ask you something else, Aparna, that has bothered me for much of my writing and researching career, which is that when you are writing specifically in the kind of themes that you're choosing, and you, Aisha, in the kind of stories that you've been telling, I know that one of the compromises I make, and this is not an excuse for why my books don't sell, it's one of the reasons I know, is that how do you depict violence? And so I know, and I see this when I read other things, that the more graphic, the more gritty, the more grotesque, the more, violence like sex will sell. And partly because of the work that I've done as an academic, partly because of the way that I read other books, I had to make a conscious decision not to do that. Knowing that this is what I'm giving up. As I say, I'm not saying that had I done it, my books would have sold anyway, but it was a decision that I had to make. And especially if you're writing for young adults, which is one of the reasons I asked about audience, the editors are very clear about what is a young adult. So I would be told, well, there's too many adults in this scene, or here are words that your average 14-year-old will not understand, or here's a reference that they will not get, and so on. And some of them I accepted, some I pushed back on, but I realize that here is what I gave up in order to not be able to, not to fall into this trap of producing violence as spectacle, as entertainment, and so on. So I was wondering how everyone feels about that and how you negotiate this in your own work, as all of you are working in this area. And so, Aparna, maybe I just throw this back to you and then move on to Atanu.
So this is such a relevant question to me. Geeti, thank you so much. And may I say that I love the way you're moderating the panel. It's, really, it's such a meaningful back and forth. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. So thank you for that.
Oh, me too.
So specifically for me, there have been times that my books have been reviewed and people have said that once you get past all the boning, there is a lot to be seen there. But I'd like to think that I do not include gratuitous violence or sex or titillation. For me, that it works for many people and that's great for them. I mean, you do you at the end of the day. But however, for me, what is implied is far more beautiful to portray than to just put it out there and say, hey, this is what happened within a closed room between two people. So in its the telling of it is all important to me. So I've never tried to kind of censor myself when it comes to language, because again, it's not a young adult audience. And the one thing that I do write, we did have a trigger warning at the beginning of my last book, because that's the first thing I told my publisher: this does not go out without a trigger warning, because I don't want anybody to step in here and realize that, oh my God, why did I pick this book up? And I did get a lot of feedback from people saying that we read it initially triggered us, but we're so glad we made the effort and read it through, because we also came out feeling seen. We came out feeling heard. So for me, that was the biggest, feedback, and the biggest blessing I could get is to be able to reach somebody's heart and to, get past that. So in that sense, I have made a conscious decision to not censor myself. And if tomorrow I do feel that there is a need for me to show a crazy raunchy threesome, I will do it with equal amount of dignity and aplomb as I would to writing a scene which involves a mother singing a lullaby to a child. According to me, it is the intent with which to tell the story, much more than the actual words you're putting on the page, that matter. So that's specifically for me.
Yeah, no, thank you. We're kind of running out of time. My God, I think we have a minute left. This is ridiculous. Sounds like a terrible science fiction situation in which we leaped out of time.
Get Hermione Granger's time turner.
I also didn't realize that.
I've been keeping an eye on the clock
sorry to interrupt you. We are absolutely okay. This is the only live session we have. Please feel free to go. The conversation is wonderful and we want you to carry it forward. I'm really enjoying this. So it's okay. I'll ping you when I feel that, it has gone a little over the slot. I just checked with Sabine as well. The rest of all are pre-recorded and they're already going live as scheduled. So this is the only last live session of the day.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Namrata. That is excellent. So in that case, Atanu, please, if you would just pick up from where Aparna left off and think about this.
Kind of answered most of the questions, and I was just wondering that fantasy as a medium has generally veered towards the young adult, and you spoke about the young adult in a certain sense. But in terms of the publication industry, I think it's really getting a bit dicey nowadays. A friend of mine, whom I will not name, who was working as a commissioning editor for a big publishing house, whom I will not name. So she would keep on calling me that if you know someone, you could send me some manuscripts, we could go through it, etc. So then she said, why don't you send me yours? I said, well, we have mostly poetry and plays. I said, no, nothing. We don't publish poetry and plays. They're not going to sell. Okay. So what we're going to do is, do you have nonfiction? Because that's really selling well. So that's the new game, I guess, in the market. So it's not just fiction now, because nonfiction, as Aparna was pointing out, does sell pretty well. So memoirs, inspirational stories, things, your own experiences of writing, how you became a creative writer. So all these kind of things provide some sort of a marketing impulse, I guess. The second thing that I also noticed I mean, I mostly write for academics, so there's a bit of research involved in that. So what I've noticed also is that in many of these texts, what we call, so you have this new genre emerging within the Indian marketing scene called the mythological fiction. So you have these old mythologies being kind of recreated through all sorts of things. So one of the things that operates within the market, I guess, is the idea of replicability. So if it is replicable within a certain format, and this is very old in the publication industry, it's not something that is new. I was thinking of films like Star Wars, which basically takes one format and keeps on repeating it, and therefore you kind of prequels and sequels and all sorts of things. So replicability is one of the factors that probably works in favor of the market, and that also determines the audience, whether the audience is replicable. And they do demographic studies in publication industry where they will find out this demography is still reading these texts, and therefore these texts can be replicated. The second, of course, in today's world, I think is also one of the things that is extremely important, which also Aparna mentioned, and probably is also something that Aisha knows about, is this intermediality of text. So whether a text can be famous enough to become an OTT series, or famous enough to become a film, or famous enough to even create a animated series or whatever. So I think that also plays a role in terms of determining the audience. So it's not, they're not simply thinking in terms of who's going to pick up a book from a bookstall, take it back home and read it on their sofas. They're now also thinking in terms of what are they going to do if they don't read the book, and if this is transformed into something else, are they going to, watch it on Netflix or Prime or whatever, or as an Insta reel? What are they going to do with it? So can we sell it off? So we have this entire, I'm sure that all of you know Rupi Kaur and people like them writing Insta poetry, which of course has a massive resistance pattern to it. But now, of course, that generic form is changing. So when we think of fantasy today, it's probably not just print media, but also other forms of media that play a role and therefore determines the audience. So audiences like the genre become more flexible in a sense. That's what I think.
Yeah, it makes me think of there's something I saw here. I'm based in Reykjavik, and I went to the cathedral here, and they had a tree on which people could pin small notes, and one of them was a note that it was quite long, and it said, when you watch the Hunger Games, you sided with the rebels. When you watched, this, you sided it. And it basically went through this list of movies and books, popular books, in which it said, when you read this, you side with the rebels. How is it that in the real world, you're busy, siding with the status quo and the government? And it really, it brought home to me so much of what we're thinking about in terms of social media and outreach and relatability, as the young people say these days, and so on. And in terms of, just to bring us back full circle, of resistance and the real world and fiction fantasy, What are your thoughts on this? I say this, and I should add that in almost everything that I've been talking about lately, at least in the last year and a half and a little more, I always say here's a shout out to all the young people and social media, because they are changing the the narrative. The rest of us writing our articles and our speeches, who knows who reads us or listens to us, but those people are changing the narrative. They're not just changing whatever it is. So thoughts about this, and Aisha, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, first, thank you, Atanu and Aparna. I'm learning a lot from both of your experiences and learning. So for me personally, beside being a filmmaker, I'm also a mother, and I've got two teenagers at home. Who one of them is a very avid fiction reader. So, and I don't have this responsibility to think about ethics when it comes to documentary filmmaking. Also have this responsibility, but I would like my daughters to read, and what I don't want them to read. And what sort of, when you were talking about violence, that reminded me of one word, which is I'm just kind of stealing from my peer when I was doing masters. It was like violence of silence. And that really struck to me at that time as to how can I portray violence instead of just doing it as we see in popular fiction and drama and everything. So for me personally in films, it's more about how I can portray violence in terms of more spiritual and slowness and gentle and somewhere in the between lines and silence. That is one thing. And the other thing that we all have been this talking about this fiction and sorry, I lost the track. But the question was, sorry.
No, I was just making the connection between fiction and real life impact on in terms of resistance.
And at the heart, I'm also an entrepreneur. So for me, everything starts from the message, what I want to say, and who I want to say. So for me, I am trained as a content creator first, and then as a filmmaker, and then as somebody, and also from coming from my personal experiences, drawing on them, who I want to say and who I am addressing and what I want to say. So for me, it goes backward from there, and then I choose and pick up stories which addresses certain message and certain audiences. So for me it goes that way. It's not that I've yet have to experience the field of writing and going to publishing house and experience that, but yes, so certainly what I have experienced in going to funding bodies when it comes to filmmaking is that you have to do those tick marks, which they have. And what happens with those tick marks, in my opinion, is that you come up with the same things over and over again, and nothing new is coming up. So that's an unfortunate thing. I'm assuming that's again with the publishing houses, they have certain requirements, then you come up with the same things over and over again. But I guess the modern world has come to the point where we have to think, in my opinion, this is what I have come to realize, is we have to think backwards. We have to start from who we are speaking to and what is the message, and then pick up the story and try to be as resistant as possible in terms of resisting the idea of status quo. Like you mentioned, my daughter is all about Hunger Games and all these books, and I'm like, why you are reading? Please, can you pick up this self-help book from my shelf and read this? And she's like, no. And that's interesting for me, and I'm kind of gonna share this insight with her, that look, this is what you are reading and this is what is gonna happen. But yeah, it's an interesting space to be in. I wonder what the world that we live in is very interesting, and from the people like us who have seen the world before the social media and now the social media, and who have the children at home. Of course, I understand we all are in the phases of life where we have the dependence to see, and I guess it's difficult, it's challenging, yet we have to adapt. I guess that's the only way to go forward for me, at least.
Yeah.
That's why I'm choosing to go into fiction and not so much documentary, because I was once told, "Now, who watches documentaries?" I'm like, well, people do watch documentaries, and but okay, but how are you going to earn money from documentaries? I'm like, people do earn money from documentaries, but then these questions are still, they are still relevant, and it's not easy out there becoming an artist. So yeah, sort your finances first, as Aparna mentioned earlier.
Don't give up your day job yet. Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that, Aisha. a few years ago, I was making a presentation on how I write and violence and fiction and so on, and I use the Hunger Games as an example. And I should say, for all the fans of the Hunger Games, that when I started reading it, I read them through from beginning to end. They are page turners. They are well written in a certain genre there. So not to diss them at all, but I use it as an example to say that violence is the plot. We know in book one that everybody except our heroine is going to die. The fact that one of the heroes doesn't die is a plus. We know that everybody is going to die, and that's the plot. And we read it not for the suspense factor of what will happen next, but to see how they will die. And the fact is that when you read it, you can see that the author is not struggling, but moving towards finding more grotesque, more fantastical, more impactful ways of killing young people. And so my daughter was 11 when she wanted to read it, and I said no. And you know what happens if you tell an 11-year-old that they can't do something, right? So of course she read it. But when she said why, and I said that why should you read books in which young people are killing other young people? There are so many other things you can read. Why must we feed young people this narrative of young people killing other young people, in which the entire effort, like the Game of Thrones, is violence. Violence is the plot. You're not reading it for the storyline. You're reading it very much like the people in the Capitol are watching the Hunger Games on their TVs. You're reading violence for entertainment. But I think that having read it, we had other conversations over it. You talk about resistance and you talk about so on and so forth. But it really, and so now when I make this presentation, she says, "Mom, don't diss the Hunger Games. No one is going to love you more if you diss the Hunger Games." So it's one of those ongoing sort of things. I can't say that the movements we see among young people on college campuses is not somehow fueled by the Hunger Games or Rupi Kaur, or how do we know? They're certainly not fueled by me. Those kids are not reading my academic writings. I know that. So,
If I may interject here, Geeti,
Absolutely.
with a viewpoint which is slightly divergent. I have an 11-year-old son, and he is what is known as ADHD, which means he's autistic, ADHD, dyslexic, dyspraxic, the works. And so it's an incredible journey for us because I get to see a lot of things which are, it's a unique experience seeing the world through Noyan's eyes, because he is just so incredibly nuanced, and he's so incredibly, I would say, savant, in the sense he's a normal kid. I'm not saying, oh, he has the ability to say, the value of pi up to 1,000, but he's savant in his ability to see the world with so many layers that we don't see, for the simple reason that as an autist, he picks up sensory cues which most people don't pick up. So the way I look at it is, when you look at violence and when you look at something like the Hunger Games, which I've not read, so I don't have that in-depth knowledge about it, but say Game of Thrones, Song of Fire and Ice. I don't think those are the things that bring the violence to our children. I think what's really bringing the violence to our children is Roblox. What's bringing the violence to our children is the ability of any person who has a Mac or who has a computer and who has a half decent program and the ability to form any game with no gatekeeping and put it onto a forum like Roblox, where it's available to a kid without the company being mindful enough to have enough parental controls in place to avoid the kinds of violence and the kinds of age appropriate things that a child should be viewing. So according to me, at the end of the day, no matter how ingenious Hunger Games may be in its depiction of violence, or how violence driven Song of Fire and Ice would be, I would still say that a child would gain so much by reading that, because there's so much more to that story than just the violence, as opposed to sitting in front of their screen for say 2 hours after they come home from school, which, by the way, I also think is a very important part of a child's day, to have screen usage. I'm not a parent who believes in banning screen usage for children, just because I believe that you have to stay with the times, you have to stay contemporary. So, and this is the way the world is moving. However, you're watching content which is made by people who may have ill intent. At the end of the day, what's the intent behind what is being watched? So it's not the act of sex itself that the child should be cautioned against. It's the way the sex is portrayed, whether there is a violence, or whether there is an ill intent, or whether there is porn being viewed which is made without the labor in mind, who's laboring behind it and who's benefiting from it. Those are the questions I feel that our children need to answer before we can allow them to view all sorts of content or read. So for example, my son finds Percy Jackson to be insane. He's amazed with the series, because Percy Jackson is about demigods, kids who basically are the offspring of gods and who are ADHD and autistic and turn out to be the sons of gods. And that's why they have these insane abilities of being able to hear and have so much feeling. And I know that my son, who struggles with sensory issues, says, "Mommy, maybe I'm a demigod too." And I think that's fantastic if that's what you want to take away from this, and it's going to help you feel special in yourself and that you have value just by being yourself. I think that's incredible. So I think the question we need to answer about what the writing is honestly, I think the Song of Fire and Ice, immensely well written book series. However, in its telling, when it came to the series, the TV series, it lost a lot in its telling, just because there was so much beautiful detail that could not be captured. And yes, they did play into more of the gratuitous violence and the unneeded sex scenes, just to make it more titillating to the audience. And while those things, I'd say, you know what, I wish it wasn't happening. I think it's fantastic, because at least out of 100 people who will watch Game of Thrones, there will be one that will say, where did this come from? And maybe they'll pick up the book. And maybe from that, they'll learn that, oh, there's not just Song of Fire and Ice. There is also so many other authors. There's a Terry Pratchett. There's a, whoever. So at the end of the day, it's the way we look at the media and the way we consume it and the intent with which we consume it, more than what is actually being portrayed. That's,
Yeah.
and now I don't even know what the question was. I just went off into a rant. So my apologies for that.
I have to say that the older I get, the more I rant. Many of my lectures are basically rants. But thank you for all of that, and absolutely agree to all of it. I think that I've never actually been a gamer, and neither are my kids, and it's an alien world to me. But I absolutely agree with all of this. Atanu, you have kids that you worry about, or
Son, yeah.
students
He
that
was,
you worry about?
I'm not really worried, but in between during the COVID era, yes, I did, because they were kind of forced back into screens, and that became normalized, which was a bit worrisome. So where you would be on screen for more than whatever 8 hours, 9 hours a day. And he did get into this, and we had to counsel him, primarily because he wouldn't get out of the screen after that. So we had a series of counseling sessions. He could not, after that, come back and start reading a book. So it was difficult in that phase. But he's kind of got out of it. And then we discovered that he was also a part of a group called Discord, which was a bit worrisome for me, because I do a bit of technology studies also, and Discord can be extremely dark web as well. But we found out that he was basically using it for creating a group of his friends, and they were playing, sharing games and all sorts of things. Anyway, so but I think the point that Aparna is making is absolutely valid, because you really can't take them away. Because if you take them away from that, they're going to finally find a way to get back to it in some way or the other. And with availability of net technology is all over the place. It's very difficult to kind of, how many blocks are you going to put? How many firewalls are you going to put, etc. The second thing is, I think, whether this is going to have an impact in real life, the question that you began with, does really all these writings, does it have really an impact in real life? I think one of the ways of looking at it is, for example, when I look at feminist science fiction, for example, so many of these writers would not only write, but would also practice what they write. So they would be a part of a large number of activism, large amount of movements that they were a part of. I was thinking of Octavia Butler, for example, Le Guin. Rokeaya Shekhawat-Hussain, she actually started a school where what she was imagining in Ladyland, in that utopian space, she was trying to do it in a school itself. So there was a translation of what their vision into the practice, that their unreal world into a real world. So that unreality could be transformed to a certain kind of a reality. So maybe that shows us one way of impact. The second way of impact in the world that we are living in, where we are constantly surrounded by a lot of white noise, but also everything that we do is mediated through screens in a certain sense. The impact, therefore, what I was talking about in terms of, this intermediality is something that we haven't really thought through yet, I guess, because it's just 20 years old, 25 years old. Come to think about it, internet came to India like 20 years back, and it's already taken over our lives. So we don't really know. So the pace of change that this kind of technology brings in has, I guess, we are going to understand the impact only, let's say, 50 years. History it moves slowly culturally in a certain sense, but technology moves much faster. So I'm not very sure exactly what's going to be the impact right now, but maybe one of the ways out, one of the strategies that we might think of is when we are talking about a certain kind of a representation, like in fiction or anything, can we also do it in forms of practice, not in terms of, and make that discrimination between what could be practiced and what could not be practiced. So obviously that discriminatory power, that critical thinking probably is something that's what is absolutely necessary that we teach our kids and teach whomever, if we are in academics, teach our students, for example, etc.
Yeah, well, this is circling back to a bunch of things that we started from. One of is that Aisha began with, how do we imagine the future? It's a kind of what if scenario. And I feel like, Atanu, you brought us back to that. The intermediality, I was just thinking that, we're thinking of adaptations to the Hunger Games and the Song of Ice and Fire as Fire and Ice have all been adapted to movies. And I was thinking how people are, I think back in the 70s, actually started writing crime fiction and thrillers with a view to the screen. So, the way that the narrative was structured was very much like a movie. And how those things change. And that would be an entirely different and wonderful discussion for us to have, how Insta poetry is changing poetry and changing the Instagram, etc. But I think that, fabulous as this discussion is, I'm going to have to bring it to a close. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for having spent this time with the three of you. And I hope we can continue these conversations. I would certainly look forward to learning and discussing with all three of you at some future time. Namrata, if we have any questions or response from the audience, if you'd like us to look at those before I'd say thank you to everyone.
No, at the moment we don't have. We just have reactions, like there are thumbs up and such reactions on that. We don't have any questions so far, but it's been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. Aparna, I'm sure you are now happy because she was very skeptical about being a part of this panel. So, you all have just, elevated the entire panel to a very, very brilliant level. It was a brilliant discussion. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for this insightful discussion. It was wonderful listening to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Namrata, for curating it. I really missed the two who weren't there. Specifically, Lavanya is somebody I know. We both were in a writer's retreat together, and she's amazing. She's this funny, witty, sparkling person. And I remember reading one of her stories before she was published. So I knew Lavanya much before she became a really acclaimed author. And she would have added so much to this panel. But having said that, it has been an absolute pleasure and honor. And Namrata, as always, you were right. I was feeling like like a sore thumb, because I was like, these are people who've written so much about actual proper fantasy fiction, and I don't know, do I even make that cut and all of that? And Namrata was like, just go ahead, you'll be good. And thank you so much. It's been I don't know whether we're still recording, but I would love to be in touch with all three of you. It has been an absolute honor. It's been such a wonderful conversation.
And thank
And
you
it's-
so much, Niti.
Oh yeah, you've been
It was
amazing.
wonderful to have you as a moderator. I mean, completely, it was a flow. I didn't even realize that we were changing topics or whatever. It was just like we're having a conversation over dinner or something. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful moderator, Namrata, for bringing us together, and Aisha, Aparna, of course, for being a wonderful panelist.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Geeti. Thank you, Namrata, Aparna, Atanu.